bit when we're asking Judeo-Christian, what are we talking about? Well, let's dig into it a little more and see and think about what this term means, because it is a fairly recent term. It's not a term you're going to find in the Bible, but it's a concept. See, the term Judeo-Christian is a concept. It carries ideas. It carries a thesis about what life is about and how we are to live it. Now, Alexei de Tocqueville, who is probably one of the most highly respected foreign observers, political scientists of American democracy and culture, he's renowned for his books called Democracy in America. They're classics. They're still read quite vigorously these days, and people quote from them still. He wrote, "I sought for the greatness and genius of America, and in her commodious harbors and her ample rivers, but it was not there. In her fertile fields and boundless forests, and it was not there. In her rich mines and her vast world commerce, and it was not there. In her rich mines, and it was not there. In her democratic Congress and her matchless Constitution, but it was not there. It was not until I went into the churches of America and heard her pulpits aflame with righteousness did I understand the secret of her genius and power. America is great because she is good, and if America ever ceases to be good, she will cease to be great." Further, de Tocqueville noted, liberty cannot be established without morality, nor morality without faith. See, this is something our current crop of politicians, especially here in Canada, seem to be forgetting. Let me repeat that. Liberty cannot be established without morality, and nor morality without faith. It's all connected. Many subsequent academics, commentators, politicians, and preachers have long believed that de Tocqueville, he was onto something when he saw this, that this greatness, is because of a vision of being good. And if we cease to have this as our goal and our vision, we're going to cease to be great. And as well as the fact that, we're not going to continue to be free if we don't have a morality that's based on faith. Now, this is kind of a shocking thought and proposition to be making in the 21st century, considering so much of what is passing for political discourse these days. But many commentators, they would agree with de Tocqueville that there has been a common Judeo-Christian ethical value system that has underpinned our success in North America and in the Western world, generally speaking, and that this common Judeo-Christian morality has long been the wellspring for, such typically distinctive cultural preferences that we have in the West for things like democratic politics and accountable, limited constitutional governments that function according to the rule of law, personal liberty and free speech tempered by an acceptance of personal responsibility for one's own actions, a free market economic system that protects private property and that rewards hard work, personal initiative, and delayed self-gratification. Together, such distinctive social values have long served the people of North America as a sort of a common civil religion that the majority has long, affirmed, believed, practiced. Where do such ideas come from? De Tocqueville noted, "The growth of nations presents something analogous to this. They all bear marks of their origin." That's an interesting thought. The growth of nations, the character of nations, the personality of nations bears some marks of their origin, the circumstances which accompanied their birth and contributed to their development affect the whole term of their being. Page 39, Alexei de Tocqueville, Democracy in America. Now, marks of their origin. When you look at our origin here in North America, there's a very clear link to what? To Judeo Christian roots. I'm going to take a quote from the Hebrew impact on Western civilization. And I'll quote here. The first book printed in North America was what? Sports Illustrated? Yeah, what was the first book printed in North America? 50 Shades of Grey? No, what was the first book printed in North America? The Bay Psalm Book. Its title page reads this. Okay, this is on the title page. It says, the whole book of Psalms, faithfully translated into English meter, whereunto is prefixed a discourse declaring not only the lawfulness, but also the necessity of the heavenly ordinance of singing Scripture, Psalms in the churches of God. Imprinted 1640. What do you think about that? 1640! The Pilgrims came over in the Plymouth Bay, in the Plymouth colony, 1620. The Massachusetts Bay colony, we're going to hear about that, was 10 years later, which was the Greater, 1630. So this 10 years out of stepping off the boat in a raw land, they were printing books. The first book to be printed was the whole book of Psalms, called the Bay Psalm Book. They were interested in printing something to use in the churches, to sing the praises of God, the Scriptures, the ordinance of God in the Psalms. That's quite interesting because, of course, I think of their ancestors, the Celtic Christians. They put very heavy influence, the Celtic Christians on reading and singing and memorizing the Psalms. That is an interesting part of it. The author of the Hebrew impact on Western civilization goes on to say that they make the observation how closely the Puritans identify themselves with the Israelites is hard to overemphasize. And they go on in their book, and there's an enormous amount of material when you look from what has been preserved from the 1600s and 1700s there in New England. I mean, it's clear. It's the fact that the Puritans identified themselves with the Israelites in the Hebrew Bible. It's hard to overemphasize, they say, because it's so remarkable. This identification becomes manifest when we realize that they actually thought of themselves as the new Israel, fighting in a land of wickedness and paganism to extirpate those who were on the side of Satan. Let's go to Philippians in the New Covenant Scriptures. Philippians. Philippians chapter 2. All right, so let's start with verse 12. So then, my beloved, even as you have always obeyed. Yes, obedience is a foundational principle for Christianity, to be a Christian. Not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you, both to will and to do according to his good pleasure. Do all things without complaints and disputes, so that you may be blameless and without offense, innocent, children of God in the midst of a crooked and perverted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. To those New Englander Puritans, the outstanding moral teachings of the Old Covenant, the Hebrew Bible, was that a nation as well as an individual could be living in covenant with God. They understood that as individuals they had a personal covenant with God, but they also saw that as communities, and since they were setting up communities, that the community could also be in covenant with God. And from this way, they did identify themselves very much in their experience as being like the Israelites coming into the promised land, and the labors and the travails and the problems and all this sort of thing. You know, I suppose, in interest of full disclosure here, you know, I grew up in New England. I grew up in the place where these people were. I grew up in New Hampshire, and you could go to many of the old churchyards and look at their gravestones and read the stories, and I was familiar with all these things. And I did as a child. I was raised in the old Puritan church. You know, the foundation stone was set in 1680. Anyways, in 1630, John Winthrop led the first large wave of immigrants from England to the New World to found the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Okay, this was different from the Plymouth. The original pilgrims came 10 years earlier. They'd struggled. Anyways, John Winthrop served as that colony's, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, for 12 of its first 20 years. He was the one of the first governors that they had. But he was a very capable leader, but and a good politician, obviously. Yeah. But he was more than that. He was also an inspirational preacher. And at the very outset of their voyage to the New World, Winthrop had the opportunity to exhort his fellow colonists, his fellow pilgrims, with his vision that the new community that they would found should be, and I will quote, a city upon a hill where the eyes of all people are upon us, close quote. Winthrop had the idea that their mission to go to the New World was for a purpose. It was for the purpose to build up a new kind of community in which righteousness should dwell. Now, where did Winthrop get his ideas? Well, in many ways, Winthrop was a good Judeo Christian. Let's go to Matthew chapter 5 and verse 14. Matthew chapter 5, verse 14, very famous scripture from this standpoint. It wasn't a scripture that is obscure by any means. Matthew 5 and verse 14, he's quoting Jesus of Nazareth. Okay, in his Sermon on the Mount, speaking to his disciples, to others, and he said to his disciples, "You are the light of the world. A city situated on a hill cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and puts it under a basket, but rather on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men so they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven." Verse 17, don't assume that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. But Jesus is saying, he's referring broadly that he is endorsing, not abrogating, the authority of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Covenant Scriptures, the Old Testament. Many people assume just the opposite, but that's John Winthrop knew better than that. Said, don't assume I came to destroy the law of the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. That is, to bring about what they said, what they prophesied. Verse 18, for I assure you, until heaven and earth pass away. Notice, until heaven and earth pass away. I mean, you're talking the latter days, the end of time. And obviously heaven and earth hasn't passed away. For I assure you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke of a letter will pass from the law, the divine law, until all things are accomplished. God has a goal. He has a purpose. A city situated on a hill cannot be hidden. There is a reason for these things. Verse 19, therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commands and teaches people to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, who would say and would not do, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. In many ways, these verses, these 6 verses in Matthew chapter 5, verses 14 through 20, they provide something of a broad theme, an inspiration, maybe even a definition if you're looking into a dictionary for what the word Judeo Christian encompasses. Because it's bringing it all together. It has a vision for the hope that rests very firmly on a revelation that has been enduring. But while, Winthrop, when he was there addressing the people, inspiring them, exhorting them that their new community should be a city upon a hill where all eyes of the people are upon us, a city in which righteousness should dwell, at the same time, he was trying to, and he did, he warned them that if they failed to uphold their covenant with God, then their sins and errors would be exposed for all the world to see. And I'll quote Winthrop from what he said at that same time, quote, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work that we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. So Winthrop was very concerned. He knew that if they would deal falsely with God, if they would abandon God, if they turned their backs on God, when things got good, or when they had many harvests and they had land and they had all these good things, he was, that eventually, if they proved falsely, that they would be brought up short to it. And where did he come up with this idea? See, on one hand, he's exhorting them to be the city on the hill. On the other hand, he's saying, remember, on the other hand, we can't deal falsely with our God. Well, he went into the Hebrew Scriptures. That's why we talk about Judeo Christianity. He went into the Hebrew Scriptures for his idea. And he went to Joshua chapter 24, and there are a couple, there are 2 verses here I want to quote that seems to relate directly to Joshua chapter 24, verse 25, and the New Living Translation, I'll read it. Joshua 24:25. So Joshua made a covenant with the people that day at Shechem. I've happened to be at Shechem. It's an interesting place there. We now call it the West Bank in Israel. He made a covenant with the people that day in Shechem, committing them to follow the decrees and regulations of the Lord. See, they had just come into their promised land. And they had had a certain amount of success, and they were establishing themselves. And so, Joshua's, he's concerned that they stay on track. In verse 26, Joshua recorded these things in the book of God's instructions as a reminder of their covenant, their agreement. He took a huge stone and rolled it beneath the terebinth tree beside the tabernacle of the Lord. Curiously, archaeologically speaking, and I've been to Shechem, as I said, there is a huge stone that was there, we saw there. It no longer had any plaster or anything there, but there was a huge stone there, which seemed sort of out of place. I mean, it was anomalous. Anyways, So Joshua took a huge stone and rolled it beneath the terebinth tree beside the tabernacle of the Lord. And Joshua said to the people, "This stone has heard everything the Lord said to us. It will be a witness to testify against you if you go back on your word to God. That is, if you are untrue to, or if you deal falsely with your God." Then Joshua sent the people away to their own homelands, to their, to their farms and ranches. Then also, perhaps Winthrop was looking at 2 Chronicles 29 and verse 5. 2 Chronicles chapter 29 and verse 5. Hezekiah said, "Listen to me, Levites." Now Hezekiah was a man, we're dealing about 700 BC at this point in time. And Hezekiah had an opportunity when he came into power. You see, the problem is the people of his God's people, the tribes of Judah and Benjamin and Levite, had really, they had become very, very lukewarm, even worse than lukewarm. And the world they were living in was changing. And at this point in time, what you had is the part of Israel, the northern 10 tribes, which had revolted against God much earlier and had done things that were not according to their agreement with God, with their covenant with God. God had sent them away into exile. And Hezekiah knew that there was a threat from the Assyrian Empire. And by the way, there is a remarkable amount of archaeological evidence from Hezekiah's time that I have personally seen. I walked through Hezekiah's temple that he built to provide a water source for the city should it be besieged by the Assyrian army, that they could still have water from the Gihon spring. I walked through it, actually. It's really rather remarkable to see. I've seen some of the walls that they built, when they tore down the houses from inside the city to make this enormous wall to try to keep the Assyrians out. I've seen various of the ostracons that from Lachish, that have been preserved in the Israel Museum when that city was besieged by the Assyrians. And of course, I've been to the British Museum and seen the remarkable wall reliefs that the British archaeologists recovered in the 1800s and hauled off as trophies, as it were, to the British Museum. It's quite remarkable because they show the besieging of the people of God by the Assyrian army, and it correlates so clearly, with the historical account in the Bible. See, these things aren't made up. The Bible is not fiction. The Bible is not fiction. Now, 2 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 5, Hezekiah said, "Listen to me, Levites." Okay, Levites were supposed to be the ministers of God, serving God. "Make yourselves ready for the Lord's service and purify the house of the Lord." I think in many ways, the whole idea of, Puritans, that they took this name, purify the house of the Lord. I think that's probably where they got their idea of what to call themselves and identify themselves among, in talking about England in the 1600s and the Church of England and the people who were doing typical church. They said, some of these things are not according to the scriptures. Purify the house of the Lord, the God of your ancestors. Remove from God's house everything that makes it impure or defiles it, that makes it ritually unclean. Our ancestors were unfaithful to God and did what the Lord said was wrong. Verse 6, they left, or they abandoned, or they forsook the Lord and stopped worshiping at the house where he lives. So the nation, they got themselves self-satisfied and prosperous, whatever it is. They said, why do I have to do this? It just takes too much of my time, too much effort. Sort of like what's going on in North America among many people right now. Many people have left the Lord. They have abandoned the God of the Bible. They have forsaken him and his morality, what he teaches. The Judeo Christian morality. That, as I said, is the foundation for the nature of our society, of who we are and what we have taken for granted. Our personal liberties, our constitutional governments, our freedoms, our economic system, everything. Our ancestors, Hezekiah said, were unfaithful to God and did what the Lord said was wrong, and they left the Lord, they abandoned the Lord and stopped worshiping in the house where he lives. They rejected, they turned their backs on him. Just as many of our leaders now are turning their backs on God. They shut the doors of the entry room of God's house, and they let the fire go out in the lamps, and they stopped burning incense and offering burnt offerings to the holy place of the God of Israel. See, this is a very graphic thing to say, oh, well, you can look at this. Yes, you can really see and picture the image of a sanctuary, these different things. But spiritually speaking, in many ways, our nations are doing the same thing in a spiritual sense. In the course of this great turning our backs on God. Verse 8, so the Lord became very angry with the people of Judah and Jerusalem, and he punished them. Other peoples are frightened and shocked by what he did to them. That is, because God made an object of dread or object of horror. Sort of, this goes back to what Winthrop said, that if we deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, then we shall be made a story and a byword, an object of dread. That's where he gets it from. He made them an object of dread, terror, horror when he punished them. So they insult the people of Judah. These things are true, Hezekiah was saying to the Levites who were standing there before him. Verse 9, this is why our ancestors were killed in battle, and our sons, daughters, and wives are taken captive. Verse 10, now I, Hezekiah, have decided to make a covenant with the Lord God of Israel, so he will not be angry with us anymore. My sons, don't be negligent now. The Lord chose you to stand before him in his presence to serve him and to be ministers and to burn his incense. Get about and do what you're supposed to do, Hezekiah was saying. And they did during his lifetime. You can read in the prophet Isaiah, how Hezekiah was a faithful man. He was a leader who came at a time, and because of his faithful leadership, he was able, God accepted, and he was able to turn away the destruction of the people of Judah at that time. It wouldn't happen in his generation. Faithful leaders who do turn back to God, oftentimes they preserve a land, preserve a nation. They lead the people into what is doing right. For centuries, these two Judeo Christian ideals, the embracing of the ideals from the Gospel of Matthew, the shining city on the hill, while at the same time avoiding the bad example of those whom the Hebrew Bible castigated for abandoning or rejecting the Bible's God. You see these two parts of it, two sides of the coin. These two Judeo-Christian ideals would dominate New England and the people of New England in their religious and cultural attitudes for centuries. And from them, it did indeed pass into all of the American people. And of course, this heavily influenced us in Canada, too. There were a lot of people who came up from New England into Canada, into Ontario after the American Revolution. There were a lot. And of course, culturally speaking, even to this day, we are greatly influenced by what goes on to our neighbors to the south of us. And it seems to preoccupy us oftentimes. Not just at Super Bowl times either. So these ideas, a shining city in the hill and, avoiding the bad example of turning our back on the Bible's God, they would continue to echo and do echo and have echo during my lifetime through the American psyche. You know, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it is, from this answer, in this way, it is very much like de Tocqueville was saying, the origins of a nation. You know, they mark it. They give these signs so that it sticks with them. It's part of who they are. On January 9th, 1961, President-elect John F. Kennedy said during an address delivered to the General Court of Massachusetts, he said this, "I have been guided by the standard John Winthrop set before his shipmates on the flagship Arbella 331 years ago. As they too face the task of building a new government on a perilous frontier, we must always consider," he said, "that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us." So, you know, Kennedy was making his exhortation that we've got to do what is right at that point in time. A number of years later, I guess 29 years later, on November 3rd, 1980, Ronald Reagan delivered an election eve address just before the election that year. I remember that election. You know, I remember saying that he had his is called the Vision for America, and Reagan said, "I have quoted John Winthrop's words more than once on the campaign trail this year, for I believe that Americans in 1980 are every bit as committed to that vision of a shining city on a hill as those long ago settlers." 1980. "These visitors to the city of Potomac do not come as white or black, red or yellow. They are not Jews or Christians, conservatives or liberals, Democrats or Republicans. They are Americans awed by what has gone before and proud of what for them is still a shining city on a hill." About 9 years later, Reagan said, and it's almost exactly 29 years ago, he said this on January 11th, 1989, he said in his farewell speech, President Reagan said, "I've spoken of the shining city all my political life." You see, at the beginning, he's coming back to it at the end of his term in office. "I've spoken of the shining city all my political life, but I don't know if I ever quite communicated what I saw when I said it. But in my mind, it was a tall, a proud city built on rocks stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds living in harmony and peace. A city with free ports that hummed with commerce and creativity. And if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and heart to get here. And that's how I saw it and still see it." That's what Reagan said in his farewell speech about 29 years ago. It's interesting. Of course, the whole concept of shining city in the hill has been used, and many politicians have used it. But the Judeo Christian ideal is crucially important. Now I want to read this. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 8. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 8. Because, you know, when we look at this, we see very clearly that the character of a nation is marked by its origins. And it's obvious, you know, from this standpoint, you know, the vision of the city on the hill, the vision of something better, a vision of goodness that has made our people great and given us some of the most prosperous lifestyle and living standards in the world. It's all so much based on this tradition, this Judeo-Christian understanding and view of what it's all about. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 8. I'm going to read this in the Amplified Bible version. By faith, Abraham, when he was called by God, obeyed by going to a place he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went, not knowing where he was going. You know, in many ways, you look at the comparison. Here is Abraham right from the beginning, and he's marked by his origins. He's marked by, the experience. And the nation that he would descend from him would be marked by this experience, just as the Puritans or pilgrims that were leaving with John Winthrop there in 1630 would be marked by this similar sort of experience and this idea. And I'm sure they saw a parallel from this too. So by faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed, going to a place which he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went not knowing where he was going. By faith, he lived as a foreigner in the land, in the promised land, as in a strange land, living in tents as nomads with Isaac and Jacob, who were fellow heirs to the same promise. Because there was this continuity that was passed down from generation to generation to remain faithful, to be faithful to what your ancestors started. Verse 10, for he, Abraham, was waiting expectantly and confidently, looking forward to the city which has foundations. And as the Amplified Version says, an eternal, a heavenly city whose architect and builder is God. See, this is a shining city set on the hill from that aspect that Jesus was referring to in Matthew chapter 5. I'm sure Winthrop knew that too when he was quoting this. I mean, the parallels is very clear. The writer of Hebrews obviously had he had this inspiration, and he's marking, that the people of God, we're looking forward to the same thing. We have the same hope that Abraham had. Verse 11, Hebrews 11, verse 11. By faith, even Sarah herself received the ability to conceive a child, even when she was long past the normal age for it, because she considered him who had given her the promise to be reliable and true to his word. So from one man, though he was physically as good as dead, were born as many descendants as the stars of the heaven in number, and innumerable as the sand on the seashore. And later on, the Apostle Paul would make this statement that if we are Christ, then we are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. The promise of this city whose foundations are laid and whose architect and builder is God himself. Now the writer of Hebrews makes this point, and it says in verse 13, all these died in faith. That is, all their lives they were guided and sustained in it. They had this inner persuasion, the pistis, this inner persuasion of what God had in mind, this shining city, and without receiving, however, the tangible fulfillment of God's promises. No, they didn't see it all happen in their lifetime. In many cases, there were many people in the Church of God in my lifetime who were initially motivated by the promises of the kingdom of God and this shining city on the hill whose builder and architect is God. And they started, but they left along the way because they lost hope somehow. They didn't see, they were not sustained by faith, believing that they would receive God's promises, that he would be good for it. So all these died in faith, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebekah, without receiving the tangible fulfillment of God's promises, only having seen them, only having anticipated them, and having welcomed them from a distance. See, it is an ideal. Judeo Christian morality, it's a promise that there is that its fulfillment, it will be rewarded and fulfilled as an ideal. And it's worthwhile focusing on these things. It's worthwhile doing these things. Only have seen them and have welcomed them from a distance, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. Because they knew they were different. They knew they were different. Abraham knew, he had this ethical morality of what he was bound to follow and to do. We now would call the Judeo Christian morality, what Abraham lived and practiced. Verse 14, now those who say such things make it clear that they are looking for a country of their own. So there they were. They were living in this land, and yet they were strangers and exiles on the earth. Because they could look around and say, this isn't our place yet, is it? Just like today, we can look around and say, maybe I was born here, but it doesn't feel like home. I'm a stranger. I'm an exile. Because I'm looking for promises, my values are different. And we're waiting. Those who say such things confess that they're strangers and exiles in our society, in our time, be clear that they're looking for a country of their own. And if they had been thinking of the country from where they departed, if they thought that was as their true home, they would have had a continuing opportunity to return. Say, well, let's just do everything the way everybody else does it. Let's go to the lowest common denominator. How low can you go? Well, I guess we're going to find in our society as we look around, it's how low they can go. We'll see. Verse 16. But the truth is that they were longing for a better country. That is a heavenly one. They were looking for a city has foundations, an eternal city, a heavenly Jerusalem, as it were, that is promised in the scriptures, whose architect and builder is God. They're looking for a heavenly one, a better country. For that reason, God is not ashamed of them, or to be called their God. The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. He's not ashamed. Consider your God, my God, because we have this faith. But the truth is, they were longing for a better country, that is, a heavenly one. For this reason, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for him. The Judeo-Christian ethic is what makes us different. It's what made the United States for so many years, we talk about American exceptionalism. Or why the Western world has been different from the rest of the world. Why we have these social characteristics. But it's because of this relationship with the Word of God. From Old Covenant to New Covenant. From the example we look at, and we look at the scriptures and the example of Abraham, and we see them in our own lives. Just as the Puritans, standing on the shore there of England, getting ready to leave for the New World, going to this place that, is completely unknown, to them. They were willing to get on the boat and sail and take the risks, risking everything they had for this shining city on the hill. And that was the goal they wanted to build. When we talk about what is Judeo Christian or Judeo Christianity, it is this ideal of looking at the scriptures and looking for this city of this hill, looking to our ancestors and following in the footsteps of those who have had faith.